Hi. We continue in 1 Samuel 19 today as the second of Saul's children chooses David over their father. And as we've been seeing on the right side of the screen, we've been following how chapters 18 and 19 have three interlocking themes that we've been looking at. So if we look at the color coding here, we can see the green represents Saul's children for or with David. We saw Jonathan last time, and we're going to see Michal this time. The blue represents David's success and his actions. And we saw in chapter 18 the refrain about David having success. And now we're going to see the refrain is him fleeing and escaping from Saul. And the red is Saul's struggle throughout this. And for the third time, we're going to see an evil spirit from Yahweh, or at least an evil spirit from God coming upon Saul. They're not all said to be from Yahweh, as we'll see in a moment. We've also been looking at the key words here, and here's the section we're going to be looking at today. And you can see easily the obvious key words are things like messengers and the question of killing, and then the phrase to flee and escape, although one time it uses the Hebrew nis for flee, and two times it uses the word burk. Burke here, it's hard to say without the vowels, that time and another time down here, and then here. So even to our next passage, you see this phrase, fled and escape. So that's the theme that we'll continue to see there. We're also going to be looking, as we saw last time, from Jonathan Jacobs, and this is the source of it, as chapter here from a larger book, Characters and Characterization, the books of Samuel, and his chapter here, Analogies Between Minor Characters, the example of Michal. And last time we looked at this from the Jonathan side, and now we're going to look at it from the Michal side, how this pattern is across both situations here, where Saul has an intention to kill David, and the child comes to know about it and tells David about it. And then the children act on David's behalf, Jonathan persuading his father not to kill him, and Michal deceiving her father. And then there's a response from Saul at the bottom. So we're seeing how these two children are parallel here. And so, as we looked at a couple of videos ago, the work of Dikla Lauer, an Israeli photographer and artist here, and her image of Michal here, as a character worthy of paying close attention to. There's a whole book on the history of interpretation of Michal relatively recently on the story of Queen Michal, and it highlights, among other things, the great contrast between writers in the late 19th and up to the middle of the 20th century, who often interpreted Michal in terms of both the standard sexism of their time, but also in terms of holding up David as a model, and therefore Michal is the opposite in many ways. So we're not going to look at it that way. We have the benefit of feminist criticism as well as cultural context to help show us that the story is certainly not trying to denigrate Michal at all here, and places her in a difficult situation between a father who wants to use her as a way to get rid of his now enemy David, and yet she is said to love David herself. So torn between father and the one that she loves. So we're going to see the character of Michal not from a prejudicial standpoint, I hope, but from what the text is trying to tell us. And so we start here in verse 8, and we'll go back to the key words thing here. In verse 8, this is really just an intervening verse to show us that some time has gone by, that what follows in verse 9 is not immediately after what we saw here. So again, there was war, and David went out to fight the Philistines. He launched a heavy attack on them, and so they fled before him. Notice how it seems like a singular action, like he went against Goliath, no longer leading the Israelites or anything called a quote-unquote army or the people, which is really what's being described, as we've seen throughout, all the way back when Jonathan was leading the people. Although we saw Jonathan and his young man went up against the Philistines at the Mishmach Pass earlier by themselves. So perhaps this is to echo that David can engage in single combat against the Philistines. But certainly that's not likely what we're expected to hear. It's more the focus is on David as the one who's doing what kings are supposed to do, which is to go out and fight the Philistines while Saul is in his house. And we'll see a parallel to that this is anticipating in 2 Samuel when David is in his house gazing up from his rooftop at one of his general's wives, Bathsheba. And so, as we saw earlier on previous video, much of what's being shown out loud here in the Saul video will be implied in the Saul story, rather, will be implied in the David story, and we'll have to remember this to make sense of it. So after we get past this verse, then we get an evil spirit from Yahweh came upon Saul. Let's look at the pattern of that we've seen. So three times, twice it's described as from Yahweh. The first time is in chapter 16, which led to the call to find someone who would soothe him, and that, of course, was the finding of David, who would play the lyre and make him feel better. Then we saw it in the previous chapter 18, and we notice the contrast, and I've translated this literally so you can hear the same contrast here as in here. that the Spirit's upon Saul, and David is playing with his hand while Saul had his spear in his hand. And in our current one, similarly, has his spear in his hand while David is playing his instrument with his hand. You can take the double entendre that we might hear in terms of an erotic subtext, playing with his hand, playing what with his hand, or what instrument here, if you'd like. And there's certainly not impossible to see this as at least a double entendre as a phallic expression, even though it's probably not expecting us to say literally David is masturbating or playing with his penis. But certainly the secondary reading of that is implied, as is obvious that the Saul's spear in his hand is a phallic symbol as well, and certainly trying to pin David to the wall with it. As you can see from this classic 17th century painting from Garcino there, and you can interpret that however you'd like. So we'll also see as we continue, not another evil spirit, but Saul's spear aiming at David 3 more times. So in the very next chapter, in chapter 20, we'll see Saul threw his spear at him to strike him, and that told Jonathan that yes, David is in fact intended to be killed by his father Saul. Then 2 chapters later in 22, we'll see Saul sitting under the tamarisk tree with his spear in his hand, and then goes into a paranoid rant against the Benjaminites for siding with the son of Jesse, who he says won't give you all the things that I'll give you, and none of you feel sorry for me. It's like like Humphrey Bogart in the Caine Mutiny in many ways. And then finally in chapter 26, so David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there found Saul lying with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and one more chance for David to turn the tables, but he won't do it. He will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, but he took the spear, symbolically castrating him here and really taking away the power of Saul to either symbolically procreate, which is to say to continue to establish dynastic successors, or to kill David. So we'll see that this theme plays out as we go. So let's look back at the key words and continue with our immediate passage here. So the evil spirit from Yahweh came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and as I was noting, while David is apparently out at war earlier, but now David is playing music, or playing with his hand. So we continue here. Saul sought to pin David to the wall with his spear, which certainly shows that what had been agreed to in the previous scene, which is what led David to be there playing with him and not running for him, has immediately been broken. Notice with no words at all. There's no apparent language for Saul to say anything to David. Out of nowhere, David's just playing his lyre for him, and Saul is sitting there with his spear and suddenly tries to pin him with the wall. But David eludes him, and so he struck the spear into the wall. If we were making a movie of this, that would certainly be a dramatic moment, wouldn't it? And he fled and escaped that night, again highlighting the pattern, not just in our immediate scene here, repeated as a key word, but also in chapter 20, 21, all the way through chapter 27. And now we're going to see this dance of messengers. And so we see the messengers here, and certainly Saul's trying to protect himself from David by having this distance, but he's also having plausible deniability here. We already saw that he intended to have David killed by the Philistines, and we saw that intention. So we already know he's certainly planning to have David killed, but if he can get away with it, not have the responsibility come back on him. So he sends the messengers to David's house, and one of the issues is, where is David's house? It's the first time here of 23 times. We know later it'll represent the dynasty, the house of David, especially in the prophecy from Nathan in 2 Samuel 7. But for now, it's certainly a physical building, but we don't know where it is in relation to Saul's house or even what town it's in. Presumably, it's in Gibeah, the same place where Saul is, because that's where Michal is, and the messengers seem to be going back and forth very quickly. But we don't know that, and we don't know anything about the house or who else might live there or what it looks like. But we're going to find out it has a window. So he sent messengers to keep watch over him, planning to kill him in the morning. And we can hear in that all the various forms of watching during the night, including over Jesus in the New Testament, as the Last Supper discourse goes on, as they plan to arrest him in the middle of the night. The verb for planning to kill here, there's a normal verb mode for to kill, but in the Hiffel infinitive construct, a rare form, it's only one other time 4 verses later, and not anywhere else in the entire Deuteronomistic history, which is to say from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, except 2 passages in Deuteronomy. So highlighting this intention to kill him in the morning, before dawn. And now Michal is described as David's wife, no longer described as Saul's daughter. And we saw last time in the conversation between David and Jonathan, really Jonathan doing the talking, he referred to Saul many, many times as my father. But here, Michal is already identified with David as David's wife. And she told him, Although yet again we don't hear his response. Just as Jonathan spoke to David and we didn't hear David's response, now Michal speaks to him and we don't hear his response. And she tells him this quite plainly: if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. In fact, what happens is not that he saves his life. What happens is she saves his life in two ways: by letting him down through the window and then by covering it up, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's scroll down a little bit so we can see a little more of our scene. So, as Fackelman notes, before him lies life which demands the courage of movement to appear from the womb. To go through the window is also birth, that of the man who can only go per aspera ad astra. Um, and I think this is Bodner below here, who says Michal does a good job of good imitation of Rahab by letting a hunted man out of a window, referring to the passage in Joshua 2. And there'll be more of women letting men down. We'll see later in 2 Samuel, but letting them down to be killed, not letting them down to escape. The window here, as many scholars have noted, is symbolic of many things. It's obviously a framing element in the literary sense, but it's also a framing element in the visual sense. And we'll see it most especially in 2 Samuel 6:16, when Michal watches David through the window down on the street dancing and revealing his private parts to the women on the streets, and then she despises him, and the narrator tells us they had no children. So twice Michal and David will interact through a window here. And so she lets him down through the window, and here's at least Marc Chagall's version of it from 1960, a very simple picture of that. He fled away and escaped, but we don't know where he escaped to. It isn't until the end of this scene that we'll find out, as we can see on the right side of the screen, that he came to Samuel at Ramah, and then he and Samuel went together and settled at Naoth, which is in the area of Ramah. So while David's gone, and before Saul gets there, or at least before Saul's messenger gets there, Michal has a plan. And she took here what's described as an idol, but the Hebrew is teraphim. We're going to look back at that in just a moment and see an interesting link. And she laid it on the bed here, first time that a bed is mentioned in 1 Samuel, and she put a net or a twist or twined goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. Would that fool anybody? Well, it seems to fool the messengers, but is it fooling readers? Because there's something else important going on here. The word teraphim is a word not used very often in the monarchy story, but it does make a nice connection to Genesis, and that's what I want to look at here, which is, and I won't look at it in detail, we'll see more of it as we go, but the story in Genesis of Laban and his daughters, which is to say Rachel and Leah, as an allegory of the monarchy. And just to mention this briefly, what I'm pointing out here is that Genesis, almost certainly written several centuries after at least the story we're looking at here, the succession story, which I'm taking as written more or less in the same time frame that David actually lived in the 9th century or so. And Genesis written in the time of exile, or soon after exile, in the 6th century. So when the monarchy was completely done, and of course that's the cause of the exile, so the monarchy came to an end. And at the bottom of my list, we see the connection of teraphim. So teraphim only one time in Genesis, and Rachel has her father's teraphim, her father Laban, and sits on them. And there's a little joke there that we'll look at in the Genesis series, not here. And that's the only mention of it, not only in Genesis, but in the entire Torah there. And then our passage here is the only mention of teraphim in the monarchy, except for one passage at the very end, Josiah's reform, where it says Josiah removed the teraphim. Teraphim culturally have two roles. One is what scholars call household gods, and that's what we see here, some kind of statue that represents family worship. But Josiah is concerned with them because they're often found in the Jerusalem temple, or at least in the palace of kings and associated with kings. So there doesn't seem to be any prohibitions against them in general, although Samuel equated them with idolatry earlier, and the word idol is implying that by making that judgment. But teraphim itself does not imply anything negative in itself. So we'll see that's one connection. And another connection is, we'll see in just a couple of verses while I'm on this chart, you'll see it here, that what Saul says to Michal, why have you deceived me, echoes what Jacob says to Laban, why have you deceived me here? And it'll come up another time as well. Both Jacob deceives, Laban deceives Jacob as to which child they'll get, which he'll get, whether that's Rachel or Leah, and then Jacob deceives Laban by running away from him and not letting him know he was going. So deception in both situations there, as in deception both by David, as we'll see later, and by Michal here. So going back to our key words, just to follow this more closely, she takes the teraphim. We don't know what they look like because, of course, the Israelites didn't keep statues like this, and so Josiah destroyed them, and there certainly aren't photographs or artistic images of them. So we don't know if this is really meant to be a human-sized thing or just a tabletop thing, but somehow it has a head, and she puts goat hair over its head and covers it here with the clothes. And as my note says, as David is hidden by Michal, so Saul will be stripped by the narrator. As Polza notes, a graphic picture of how the narrator hides David and bears Saul, and covers it with the clothes. And this is the first time we hear the Hebrew beged here for clothes, and it'll come up a number of times, frequently in the context of deception or authority, as we'll see. So she does that, and now Saul sent messengers to take David, and she says he's sick or weak. And what we don't know is whether on this round they see the bed with the goat hair covering the teraphim, presumably the clothes there looking like a sick person in bed, or whether they just respond to her word that he's sick and go back. What's not narrated is the return here between verse 14 and 15. So plainly, Saul sent the messengers to take David, and she said he's sick, which implies they went back to Saul, and he sent them again to see David for themselves. So once we have this verse, we can infer that they just simply saw Michal and didn't get to see the teraphim at all. So in that case, they never saw it, and it didn't come up as a matter of whether her deception was successful or not. The words were deceitful enough that he is sick. And so Saul says, bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him. And my note has plainly Saul has lost it here because there's no possible reason can there be for carrying the bed along. But some scholars have noted there's a figure of speech here, like just, it doesn't matter if he's sick or not. If he's sick, just bring him in so I can kill him. And so the messengers now do come into where the body would have been, but the teraphim is in the bed covered with goat's hair. And what the new RSV leaves out, unfortunately, is the behold, the henna. And if this is not of a henna moment, I don't know what is. When the messengers came in, behold, the teraphim was in the bed. And of course, that echoes exactly what we might expect, that when Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah and not Rachel. And so we'll hear a number of echoes there of how the Jacob and Rachel story are echoed into our story here. So Saul says to Michal, why have you deceived me like this? Like Laban says to Jacob in chapter 31, and like I already showed you that Jacob said to Laban in chapter 29 in Genesis, why have you deceived me like this? And the word for deceived here in Genesis 29:25 is the only time that's used in the Torah where Jacob complains about Laban, in contrast to this one here where Laban complains about Jacob 2 chapters later. And let my enemy go, making clear that we already knew, that David is now Saul's enemy, even more so than the Philistines, so that he has escaped. And Michal answered with something that we're not sure whether it's a lie or not. He said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Did David threaten to kill her? Well, that wouldn't make sense that he would threaten to kill his wife, but maybe he did if he's trying to escape from Saul, and that's the only way to get her to release him. Or it's a lie, and she's portraying him that way. And notice the term let me go here is part of the key word for let go here that's often translated as send, and I translated it literally as let go so we could see how many times it's used here. So as Saul lets messengers go to Michal and to David, David, according to Michal, tells her to let me go. Why should I kill you? And now David again flees and escapes and comes to Samuel, someone we might have thought was done with the story, but he's not. And so we'll continue with that as we see further in chapter 19, as Saul is told David is at Naioth and Ramah, and suddenly encounters a bunch of prophets, and Saul is again numbered among the prophets. A surprising twist, and we'll see that next time. Bye-bye.